If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Hello, Quillers, and welcome back to another exciting episode of your favorite Shakespearean podcast, Did You Miss Me? I want to tell you, today's podcast is a little bit different, a little bit special, because I do not have an in-studio guest today. I'm not in studio. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But before we begin, I wanted to say how much gratitude I have for so many of you Quillers out there who have sent me emails or just quick little posts as encouraging fans telling me how much you like the show and your favorite episodes. And we really do appreciate that. I know producer Jake would agree with me. We really do appreciate those wonderful emails. We also appreciate the emails of criticism. We do. So you can keep those coming as well, because it won't be long before we will have another Quill the Messenger episode of the show where we talk about some of your darts at us for what we do here. But of course, we want to always thank our tremendous sponsor, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, who makes this show happen. And it's because of them that you get to find this show as often as you do. So be sure to support that by making your donation to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Or if you'd like, go get yourself some Quiller swag, because we have some wonderful products available in the swag store at don'tquillthepodcast.com. So check that out. And we want to thank you for all of your support. It's been awesome. It's funny because when I do meet people face to face who are fans of the program and we've met for the very first time, they're so familiar. They feel like they know you. They ask me about Annie, and it's great. I love that. It's wonderful because it's a privilege for me to be with you in your car or your study or in your headphones while you're exercising or wherever it is where you're listening to this program, because, you know, I know how it is. You decide you're going to stream or you load it to whatever device that you're going to listen to it later. And you go about your thing and you turn it on and you listen. And, you know, Annie used to talk about how she would listen to like half the show on one way to work and then half the show on the way home from work. So wherever you're listening to me, I feel privileged to be with you. There's a lot of challenges to producing a show like this: scheduling guests, coordinating the technology, editing raw files, which I don't have to do. I just have to upload them, send them off to where they belong. Creating the graphics, which producer Jake does for each episode, uploading the files, spreading the word via social media, fielding your emails, maintaining the swag shop. And I'm sure there's several other things that Jake is doing that I'm forgetting, but he isn't here with me right now to remind me of what they are, because I'm recording this episode for you remotely from my home studio in Southern Oregon. One of the great advantages to being in my home studio, however, is that sitting right in front of me is my library of Oxfordian literature. One of the difficulties I find being an Oxfordian, especially being the host of this show, where then I have people I know who I encourage to tune in and they stream it and then they come back with me and they have certain questions and they want to talk about the topic, which I'm always glad to do, obviously, because I'm talking about it right now to all of you. But one of the things I find most difficult is to discuss this topic with people who haven't read anything about the topic. And that's not an indictment. And one thing that Oxfordians have to be very careful about, and we have to guard against, is that that level of impatience that we can have with those who hold staunchly to their Stratfordian beliefs, but they haven't truly read or studied anything else. And, you've heard me use the analogy, I'm sure, in previous episodes about, like walking into the house of a physicist and start trying to tell him about the laws of physics when he's the guy who has the degree and the experience in the field of study, and you don't. A lot of people who hold to Stratfordian beliefs, if you truly ask them, if you truly narrow down to like how much they have given their time to the topic, many of them will have to admit that, and maybe some of you who are listening would have to admit, well, now that you mention it, I haven't spent a lot of time. Maybe for some of you, the most amount of time you've spent is listening to this program. That's fine. That's great. But hopefully it has intrigued you to want to learn more and to spend a little bit more time looking into the topic. And I hope that a big part of that is it draws you to the SOF website, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. That's ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, your source and resource for everything to know about the 17th Earl of Oxford. So go visit there if you haven't. I'm sure most of you have. But also one of the things we're going to talk about today is like a library of study. And some of the books that I think are most important to me as an Oxfordian. We'll talk about some of those. Some of them and we've talked about them before, and we've had guests on who are the authors of those books. But some of them maybe you don't know or we haven't talked very much about, and I'm going to share some of those with you on today's episode. But I want to get back to this importance of guarding against our impatience with those who haven't studied. From our perspective, we have read every shred of information that we can find on the Stratford guy. And we continue to read everything we can get our hands on about our guy. And so it can be frustrating when you're talking to somebody who holds so strongly to the Stratford guide, especially because you know everything they've been able to read on that guy, because there's only so much that exists. But then you also know that they haven't read anything about our guy. And so rather than get annoyed and want to shut them down for that, we've got to figure out a way to introduce them to literature about our guy. Because I believe the more you learn about Edward de Vere, the more it becomes clearer and clearer every day that he's the guy. So we'll get into some of the things that you can read that will help open up those doors, I think, and some of the titles that I think you can then share with other people, because people who come to this inevitably want to talk to other people about it. And I think that's great. I think that's a big way of how it all works, of how we convert the world one Oxfordian at a time, is by sharing these details and this truth. So I know in our anniversary guest, we revisited many of the book titles of some of our very illustrious published guests. But I want to take some time to go through a list of my library suggestions. And before I do that, I want you to think about these couple of things. First off, ask yourself, what is the benchmark for a graduate or postgraduate degree? Truly, what is the benchmark of learning in our society? And this isn't an indictment on so many of our listeners and so many of our guests too, who are men and women of letters. We have those with bachelor's, master's, and PhDs. And so they're the most qualified to answer the question of what is truly the benchmark. Yes, there are theses and projects and those kinds of things that you have to complete in order to obtain, capstone dissertations. But what is truly the key to all of that? And if the answer isn't books, then I'm not sure I know much about learning. And if you think about it, most degrees are truly founded in the number of hours a student spends reading, comprehending, and absorbing book upon book on the subject at hand, or the subject that is the specialty of their degree. And spending a certain number of hours attending lectures on that subject by others who have read and in most cases also published books on that subject. That's pretty clear. So I want you to remember that. I want you to think about that for just a moment as I move on to the definition of virtuoso. Right? A virtuoso, according to some scientific studies, in fact, requires approximately 10,000 hours committed to an art form or a craft. So, for instance, a virtuoso pianist spends 10,000 hours at the piano in order to become a virtuoso. That's an interesting calculation. But apparently there was, and I don't remember right now clearly the name of the university that did the study, but apparently there was a study about this, and that's what they determined. They determined 10,000 hours. And then you do the math and you do the calculations about, well, how many hours a day that would be over how many years and what kind of a lifetime, etc. And you find that, well, yeah, that makes sense, especially when you look at some of the virtuosos that we've seen in modern times. Many like violinists, pianists, they're very, very young people who have done nothing but that art, that instrument, whatever it is, for an intense amount of time throughout their lifetime. Not unlike the story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, right? Raw talent, absolutely necessary, but also a near tyrannical father who forced him to practice, and, used him very much so for the prominence that he himself would obtain through putting his son out there on the stage. He was one of the first child actors, truly, if you think about it, Amadeus. But he had to do more than act. He had to play that piano, play the harpsichord at first, right? So anyway, not to digress too far from that, but what I'm talking about is hours spent at the topic, at the subject, on the source material, on the application of that material, and then the execution of it, right? So if we want to look at Shakespeare as a master, as a doctor of neologism, and I would argue, or as a virtuoso, then we have to accredit him these hours and hours and hours spent doing what he would need to do to study to be as good as he became. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, requires books. Lots and lots of books. Lots and lots of hours spent reading those books. So I'm glad we had a chance to kind of like put that into perspective. When you've spent that amount of time studying a subject, and then you find yourself faced with someone who has spent very little time studying the subject, that can be very frustrating. So let's do our best to try to encourage those who have not studied the subject to do a little bit of studying. And if you're one of those people listening to the program and you're like, well, I've heard you mention this book, I've heard you mention that book, thought about reading this, I thought about, who has time to read? Well, the first thing I would say is then definitely visit the website and read what's there. It's easy to scroll through some of the articles there, some of the fact pages that you can find, and some of the resources that are mentioned there, and some of the other websites that we would direct you to as well from that site. And so if that's the place where you need to start because, diving into a book is, daunting, well, then start there. I can tell you one of the earliest books on the subject I ever read, and I was actually able to obtain this copy online many years ago through a company called Kessinger Publishing. And it's very much like a sort of a odd-shaped pamphlet style publication, and it's called a licensed reprint. And there are errors in it, several in certain places, some glaring typos, and which, I've been guilty of a few. But it's interesting that, here in this published final product, but it is Shakespeare Dead by Mark Twain. And it's a very quick, light, and as you can imagine, humorous read. Because it's Twain. And if you can't start anywhere else, start there, because that will wet your whistle, and it will definitely turn you on to some other things that you'll want to look into. I know that some of you have written to us about being careful of, getting into the weeds too much with some of our guests and with some of the material that we cover, and especially when we dive into these books. But it's difficult to introduce you to a book without diving into some of the pages. And some of them are easier to do than others, obviously. And I wouldn't steer you into Greek tragedy if you'd never read a play for the first time ever, right? I wouldn't say, oh yeah, here, how about some Euripides? Enjoy that. So some of these things are about baby steps and getting into them a little deeper, a little further as you become more intrigued, or as you learn more, as you grasp more, you want to dive in more. But some of you have also asked about wanting to know more about the personal journeys of some of our guests, just as Annie sort of shared her personal journey in the episode with her about how she eventually became an Oxfordian. And we've had a couple of some of the actors who have been on the series have talked about that as well, and their experiences with me. So we're going to try to, in future interviews with future guests, accommodate that request by asking them a little bit more about, their journey as an Oxfordian, and what books and what things influenced them and helped them along that path. So here I am staring now at what I would call my essential library on the Shakespeare authorship question. But before we go into that, one quick note. You see how I've been using that hook to keep you listening? It's like, what titles? What titles is he going to tell me? Is he going to ever tell me a title? Yes, I swear I am. But truly, I just, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, want to talk about how collections of books become what I mentioned earlier, my essential library. They become libraries. And no, this is not a commercial for go support your local library, although you should do that, because libraries are one of the great institutions of civilization, and I think necessary to the continuing of this civilization. So libraries are important. Why? Because libraries are access to knowledge, and that is key. Access to knowledge is the key to obtaining knowledge. Books, or their popular form of their day, scrolls, parchment, papyrus, cuneiform, written language has been the common component for the great majority of the geniuses of the world throughout history. Their exposure to it, their ability to read it, and their ability to have it available to them has been that common thread. And I would argue that that is the common thread for this genius known as Shakespeare. What made Edward de Vere truly capable of what he was able to do was definitely a combination of genius, opportunity, personality, no doubt. He was a crazy Aries. Those of you who know anything about astrology, headstrong like a ram, but also could land on his feet whenever he had to. Combination of genius, opportunity, personality, environment, and education. But the key to that education was in the library he had access to, and the books he later obtained for himself. And as we know from his Geneva Bible, books were not something he read and put on a shelf. Right? He spent hours and hours and hours with his books. This is proven through the amount of passages in that Bible that are underlined, and the marginalia and the notes and all the things that you find in what our guest, Professor Roger Stripmatter's, historic study on that particular document, the Geneva Bible, all of the things that he revealed there. So that proves this guy used his books, right? He read them over and over and over, and he studied the way language worked and the way that words formed together and the way that punctuation was used, because he needed to do so in order to become a virtuoso of those uses. You talk to writers today. I want to say that Stephen King is very popular for having said at a lecture series or as an answer to a question at some symposium or book signing, when he was asked, what is the key to being a good writer? And he said, read other good writers. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I tell actors all the time, one of the best ways to become a better actor, go watch other actors. Do what they do. So the key to Edward's education was in the library he had access to, the books that he was able to read. I hope to live to be old enough someday to read the vast library that I have on my shelves. My wife, Annie, hopes so too, especially since she chides me very often for having so many books. We moved to Southern Oregon, and we had a certain number of bookshelves that came with us, but we also have now had to purchase a couple of extras to finally unbox some of the books that I have that I've been holding on to for some time. And I have a collection of certain ones that are not just my Oxfordian library, but my Shakespeare library, as well as then, I'm into very old books like leather bounds and cloth bounds. One of my prized possessions is my collection of Twain's that's more than 100 years old, poor ragtag cloth bound editions. My Dickens collection, my Brontes, which are leather bound and beautiful and in great condition still. The 100-plus-year-old pocket size editions, that men could keep in their breast coat pocket of their suit jacket. And so, yeah, Annie's like, I hope you can read these books all someday. And it reminds me of that famous story, and I believe it was President Roosevelt and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. I know it was definitely Holmes, but I could be wrong about the president that was involved, who came to visit Holmes when he was in his late 80s or early 90s and found him reading Plato in the original Greek and asked him, what are you doing? Justice Holmes, Your Honor, I believe it was, Your Honor, why are you reading, at your age, why are you reading Plato in original Greek? And Justice Holmes, under legend, said, to improve my mind. Well, hopefully we all can have that sort of attitude, right? And continue to attempt to improve our mind through continuing to read. And so let's move on now, after this wonderful introduction, to what you've been waiting for, which is, what should I go out and get? Well, one of the first things, and you've heard me talk about this before, one of the first things I ever read on this subject, I talked about one of the things that you should get if it's one of your first little things is Shakespeare Dead? But I didn't actually get Is Shakespeare Dead right away. One of the first things I got was a copy of the Tennessee Law Review. Yes, that's right. It's a legal journal. Tennessee Law Review. And it is volume 72, number 1. Tennessee Law Review, volume 72, number 1, fall 2004. It's 454 pages, and it contains a collection of the symposium articles from a symposium that was titled "Who Wrote Shakespeare? An Evidentiary Puzzle." And there's a very large editorial board listed here. There are student material editors as well who help put this thing together, and a huge instruction, huge preface inside about the symposium and what it entailed and how it was called together and why. And it was a rousing success. It says right here, that's a direct quote. The symposium was a rousing success. So there you go. And it contains great articles by some wonderful people, including people you've heard mentioned here or even heard here on the program, one of whom is Diana Price and Roger Strittmatter. Also, there's a interesting piece in here by Stephen May. Richard Whalen is included in here multiple times. And this was a deep dive for somebody really fresh to this topic. But it was recommended to me by a guy who was one of the first people to really encourage me to look further into Oxfordianism. He's the guy who turned me on to Freud as an Oxfordian. He's the guy who turned me on to the Tennessee Law Review. And ultimately several other publications, including, of course, Shakespeare Identified. And we'll get back to that one in a minute. But his name was Elwood Leroy Miller. And among some of the more obscure items in my Oxfordian library is a series of plays written by Mr. Miller, as well as a book of sonnets that he wrote sort of in the fashion of the Shakespearean sonnet. The titles of the plays are Insequent Toils. That's the first one. The second one is called A Labor of Love. And the third one is called Ignoto's Farewell. And they're very Oxfordian plays. They present a very interesting Oxfordian premise that includes, in the drama of the plays, it includes the Queen basically making the edict that Oxford will never put his name on anything ever again at some point in his life because of some things that he did. And we all know some of the things that he did. But Mr. Miller sort of throws out the theory in the drama that the stripping of his name was a punishment, that the Queen knew how much that would affect Edward and that it would be a punishment to him for some of his misdeeds, that he could never put his name on any of his work ever again. But they're a great read if you can get your hands on them. Elwood Leroy Miller. So those are some of obscure titles, and I'll get back to some other obscure things in my collection as well. But I, of course, want to move directly on to what was the next big one for me, of course, was Shakespeare Identified. That's Shakespeare Identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, by J. Thomas Loney. This is the 100th anniversary, the centennial year of that publication, which was March 4, 1920. And of course, this year on March 4, 2020, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship will host a symposium celebrating that centennial. And there will be several prominent speakers, many of whom have been guests on this program, who will be attending that symposium and presenting at the symposium at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And it's part of a string of events that are happening throughout the United States in different places where different members of the organization are hosting Oxfordian events to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the first publication to identify Edward de Vere as the true author Shakespeare. This copy that I have, which I think might become a collector's item someday, is a reprint by General Books. That's pretty obscure if you can think about that. It says modifications copyright 2009 by General Books, published by General Books. And you want to talk about typos and weird. It's almost as if they took one of the original copies of Loney's book and they put it through a scanner and told it to translate what it was scanned into the formatted pages for this book, because there are some really weird sections where half words show up in places, where a word from a sentence 3 sentences below shows up in the wrong spot, weird hyphens that don't belong. Like here, I'm looking at page 200, and it's listed here. It says, only as we realize his spontaneous hostility to the social and political tendencies represented by Burleigh, Wall, space, Singham. I don't know why there's a hyphen in the space in the middle of Walsingham. Sidney, Raleigh, and Folk Greville, shall we be able to judge him accurately or adjust ourselves properly to the Shakespeare problem? Then there's another couple lines down where there's a sentence that breaks, and it says, contempt, shake, puri, religious and political movements, or spear, and the attitude taken by the group of men we have just named. So, it's really weirdly formatted. So I'm thinking that this was maybe not particularly licensed, or I'm not sure what they did here, but I was able to find it years ago online, and you can't find it like this anymore. You can find the new revised edition that James Warren has put together and is now available. And that's a much better copy to have and a much cleaner read and much easier to follow. So you definitely want to have Shakespeare Identified, especially now in the 100th anniversary of the publication of the book. So then the next book for me was a book called Shakespeare, Who Was He? And this was Richard Whalen's book. And Shakespeare, Who Was He? The Oxford Challenge to the Bard of Avon. And this copy I have is also an interesting copy from Prager Publishers. And it's a plain white cover with just this black rectangle and white letters inside the black rectangle. It's a very unopposing book. It's not a very long book, so it's much easier for people to start to get a grasp of the argument, of the theories. And there are some images, including the images of the Shakespeare monument, images of the Shakespeare signatures. So it's a great one. It was a wonderful book for me to follow up Shakespeare Identified. And that's exactly what happened for me. But then next was the real biggie, the one that really solidified everything for me. And it is the book that I have recommended most to people. I think it's the book that has done more to convert people to the truth of Oxfordian beliefs. And it is Shakespeare by Another Name by Mark Anderson. It's such a comprehensive book in so many ways. And it is formidable. You know, it's a big, thick volume. A lot of the back portion of it, of course, is, you know, the footnotes and references. But it really did the best job for me of laying Edward de Vere's life out and then taking the Shakespearean canon like an overlay and placing it on top, and then turning the light on like those old-fashioned overhead projectors that they used to have in elementary school. I don't know if they still use those in schools. I doubt it. They probably have screens now and everything. But you know, the old overhead projectors where you had the plastic overlay and the teacher would write in like grease pencil or something so she could wipe it off later and reuse those overlays. Well, that's how I kind of liken Shakespeare by Another Name. Those of you who are too young to know what the heck I'm talking about, I'm trying to think of a better reference that would work, but I don't know that I actually have one for you. But it was like taking two things, and it was a mashup. It was the perfect mashup of two songs that belonged together. And that solidified it for me. And suddenly I wanted to voraciously learn more and read more. And truthfully, the next big book for me was the big book for me at the time, and that was The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality by Charlton Ogburn. The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality. And this version that I have here actually refers to him as Charlton Ogburn, with the foreword by David McCullough. And it was, let's see if I can figure out a publishing date on this, because I'm not seeing it right away, at least not inside the dust cover. But I do have the dust cover. And it's actually one of my prized possessions because it's in such great shape. But this one is from, my goodness, 1992. 1992, second edition, fourth printing. So there you go. It's not as old as the original publications, but it's a pretty good one. It's a pretty good volume, and it has that great picture where the portrait of Shakespeare as we know it, the droshet engraving, is cracking away, and underneath is Edward de Vere showing through. And if you think about it, that cover is very much like the cover. And I don't know, maybe Mark Anderson has talked about this before and mentioned that if he was trying to do a similar thing with the cover of Shakespeare by Another Name, the original hardcover cover, where you've got the Ashbourne portrait, and it's torn away, and underneath it is Edward de Vere. So those two are, real biggies, and it's interesting that when I have them next to each other, how much they resemble each other in that sort of feel. So I'll have to ask Mark, or I'm sure some of you listening maybe already know the answer to that, and you'll send us an email and let us know. Okay, next on the list, The Shakespeare Guide to Italy. Of course, Richard Paul Rove's magnificent volume. And one of the things that I love about Richard Paul Rove's The Shakespeare Guide to Italy, retracing the Bard's unknown travels, is he doesn't mention Oxford in the publication, in the book. That's not what it's about. It's about saying whoever wrote these works was there. He knew what he was talking about. He knew so specifically what he was talking about that he must have been there, and he must have been there and traveled the country most completely. And, I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes, and that is that Annie and I twice have now planned trips to Italy, and we were going to follow sort of the, Richard Rowe path, sort of the Shakespeare tour of Italy. Going from Rome up through the northern areas where Oxford loves so much. We want to go through Florence and Milan and Siena and Padua and Pisa and all of those places that the characters mention, or the plays are set, or the characters are from, as places that either he was or that he was enamored by stories from, because he was so close to those places. And many of you know our second daughter, her name is Siena, spelled like the city in Italy, because we were on our way to go there when we learned that she was going to be a part of our family, and had to change our plans instead. And so one of these days we're going to plan that trip and finally do it. And we're going to take Richard Rowe's book with us when we go. The next one I would put on your list is such a quintessential piece of the puzzle. And, of course, since its publication, there are people who have questioned some of the findings and have proposed alternatives of their own. But Kevin Gilvary's Dating Shakespeare's Plays, a critical review of the evidence, opens your eyes to, in a more detailed way, some of the aspects that, when you look at Mark Anderson's book and the life of Edward de Vere and how it plays out through the canon, I think that the two of them complement each other in a lot of ways. Just like Richard Rowe's book complements such, the 16 months of Edward de Vere's life when he is on the continent, or the 13 of them, I believe, in Italy. So that's why it's like a really good one for next in the chain. Of course, Hank Whittemore's Monument is one that we have an episode on, and we talked thoroughly about with Hank. 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford is Hank's other great publication. And that's another great episode where we went through the book and I just started pointing at numbers and he started telling me what those reasons were and what they were about. Jeffrey Ayres, that's Eyre. Jeffrey Eyre, The Case for Edward de Vere as Shakespeare, is a very quick and easy read. Another one that is interesting to add to the list is John Mitchell's Who Wrote Shakespeare. And it's a very good overview of the Shakespeare authorship question. If you can get your hands on any of the Brief Chronicles copies, which you can access through membership in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, you'll find, so many great pieces in each of those volumes to take you into more details about very specific topics that are off of the side of the story. I don't want to call them tangential, although there are many topics that become tangential from all of this. It's a very complex issue. It was a very complex society. These were very complex people, and that's why the plays are so full of very complex characters. And if that statement was too complex for you, see what I did there? Anyway, also get your hands on, if you really want to dive into this, you want to go into this like both sides, get your hands on a copy of Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which is the Stratfordian version of the book. And then get your hands on a copy of Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, ? Which is the Oxfordian's version of the book. And, those are great side-by-side volumes to really dive into and see, which side of the voter pamphlet you really want to place your little black dot. Some of the more recent books that have come out that we've talked about on the air include the poems of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, and the Shakespeare Question, Volume 1, He That Takes the Pain to Pen the Book by Roger Strittmatter, and that was an episode that we also did earlier last year. There's Necessary Mischief by Bonner Miller Cutting, another episode that we did not too long ago with having Bonner on, talking about some of the magnificent details in her book, chapter by chapter. Another newer book that is out that we'll have to have our guest Brian Wildenthal come back on the program again. You'll remember Brian. He was with us for basically the first episode of the broadcast when we talked about Shakespeare 101 together. And we'll have to get Brian back into the studio or have him connect in with us about his book, which is about early Shakespeare authorship doubts. And it sort of gives you just a whole timeline of when people first started talking about this whole thing and alluding to the whole thing and sharing their little private notes and who knew what and why and how. And it's a fascinating aspect of the whole controversy. Some dramatic literature. Of course, we talked about Hank's one-man show, Shakespeare's Treason, and he assures me that he is doing a simple rewrite of that so that it could be a one-man play for anyone. For that matter, it could be a one-woman play for anyone to put together and perform, which would be awesome. And then I also happen to have a copy of Daryl Blake's play, Nothing Truer Than Truth, being the life and times of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, sometime known as William Shakespeare. And it's a fascinating, dramatic piece. that's a lot of fun to read. A copy was given to me by Oliver Kinsey, and it'd be interesting if we could get maybe some guests from across the pond to come and join us. I know that Julie Bianchi is trying to work on putting something like that together so that we can possibly, the time change, of course, makes it very difficult, but we do have some experts across the pond who would make great guests here on the program. And then I talked about, obscure parts of my collection, and here are two that are very exciting, especially if there are young people in your life. And they are Norma Howe's books for young adults. One is called The Adventures of Blue Avenger, and the other is called Blue Avenger Cracks the Code. And you may remember Annie and I talked about those two books. She bought me these two copies that I have because early in our dating relationship, when I mentioned to her that I was an Oxfordian, there was an immediate connection because she said to me, "Oh, I've read about that." And I was shocked. I said, "What? Really? Where?" And she said, junior high school. And she said, "Yeah, the Blue Avenger books." And I was like, I had no idea what the Blue Avenger books were. So she went out and she bought them for me. It was one of the earliest gifts that she ever gave me were my copies of the Blue Avengers books. And so that just goes to show how important it is to have access to books and reading, because look what that did. That opened her mind to this entire topic in such a way, just through reading something different than what everybody else was reading, or something that was focused on a special topic in a special way. Another book that is available for young people is Lynn Kazitsky's book. And I just recently got a copy of that. A Question of Will is the title. And it's a quick little read. And it's interesting because I bought mine used because it was out of publication. Well, it's now back in publication, and so you can get brand new copies of it. But I bought mine used, and when it came to me, it's actually signed by Lynn Kazitsky. And it says, "To Jeff forever. To Jeff forever, Lynn Kazitsky." And ever is spelled with a capital E and a capital V. And so I don't know who Jeff is, but I'm going to cherish my signed copy of A Question of Will, signed by the author herself, Lynn Kazitsky. So I hope that you have enjoyed this trip through my Oxfordian library. Who knows, maybe somewhere in a future episode, we'll go through my Shakespeare library, because that's a whole nother thing. And it includes Asimov and Bloom. Of course it does. It must. I have at least a dozen different copies of the complete works from different publishers and different versions, and some annotated and some not, and some illustrated and some not. And then, of course, a variety of different books, such as, Shakespeare in the Stars, and How to Teach Shakespeare, How to Speak Shakespeare, the Shakespeare Glossary, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about those maybe at another episode, including, I know I mentioned in the episode where Julie was on talking about Shakespeare and playing cards, I have a Shakespeare-themed tarot deck that my mother bought me as a gift many years ago that I cherish. So, but that'll be for another time, because we are about out of time here for this episode. I want to thank you again for allowing me the privilege of joining you wherever it is that we are right now together as you listen to the program. And indulge your patience as we put together some lineups of some new guests and try to keep getting episodes out to you on the regular basis that we have done so over the past year. Bear with us as we try to overcome some of the technical difficulties of doing long distance interviews and recordings from off sites like this one today. And if you've heard some oddness in the background, it's because just getting used to still this new home studio here in Southern Oregon. We're going to bring you some interviews from some local folks around here in the Southern Oregon area, close to Ashland and the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, as we get closer to this year's annual Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference, which will be held in Ashland, Oregon, at the end of September, first few days of October 2020. So if you want to know more details about that, I believe they're already available at the SOF website. And remember, that's ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. Please, if you haven't already, go to your download provider, if they allow a place for you to like the show or give a rating to the show or give a written review. We would greatly appreciate that. Let the world know that we're here and that this is something that is somewhat entertaining and, if nothing else, very informative. And so if you'd spread the word, we'd appreciate that as well. And don't forget, you can go to dragonwagonradio.com, dragonwagonradio.com, and go to the swag store. And not only at the swag store will you find some great Quiller merchandise, but you'll also find some great other podcasts that you might be interested in listening to. We are part of a magnificent network, the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, and there are a variety of great shows available for you there that you might also be interested in. So you might want to check those out. And please share us with a friend. With that, I will leave you today in your car, in your workout room, in your study, at work, on your computer when you shouldn't really be listening to this podcast. Wherever it is that you are, I do want you to always remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.